What it's like to be fired from your own company, come back in 10 years and create a #1 in the world brand by fixing mistakes you made. Let's take Steve Jobs as an example. He's 100% responsible for his dismissal from Apple. Wow guys, you didn't know that? One of the most famous businessmen in the world was fired from his own company. Yeah, because of his further success, nowadays the decision of the Apple board of directors to fire Jobs seems unimaginable. But at that time, Jobs was out of control. His ego clearly got out of hand. If you were John Scully, CEO of Apple at the time, you would have fired that version of Steve Jobs too, and you would be right in doing so. John, by the way, came to Apple from Pepsi to change the structure of the company, and he was hired by Steve himself. Steve Jobs was a famous egoist of that time. He did not recognize his first daughter parked in spaces designated for disabled person, did not have license plates on his car. At 25, he became a dollar millionaire and took the company public. Apple was on everyone's lips, and new major shareholders invested in the company. After entering the stock exchange, all principals of Apple became rich overnight, and it really turned Steve's head. Yes, he was a genius, but he considered his genius to be one of a kind. He did not understand that along with the big money that came to the company came a lot of power, and not his power, but the power of the board of directors. Scully himself decided to tell the world the story of how it all happened only about 10 years ago. He blames the company's board of directors for the split. Moreover, when he first came to Apple, he was sure that the board understood both Steve and Apple in general. In 1985, Jobs got acquainted with Paul Berg, a biochemist and Nobel Prize winner who shared with Steve his vision for a computer for research in the world of science. According to him, it was supposed to be a personal computer. Powerful, but affordable. At the time, Jobs was the head of the division responsible for the development of the Macintosh and Lisa personal computers. By the way, Lisa was named after his daughter. Shortly thereafter, he also began work on the Big Mac project. However, in the fall of the same year, the project was closed. As Scully recalls, the downfall started with the presentation of the Macintosh Office system, the second generation of Mac. Then, in 1985, the board not only didn't understand the young genius, but also ridiculed his idea. The board considered that this was just a toy that could not exist in reality due to the modest capabilities of the computer of those times. Then, Jobs went through a very difficult period that was close to depression. When he came to his partner John Scully, having said that he wants to reduce the price of the Macintosh and direct part of the advertising costs from Apple II to the Mac, Scully did not agree with it and decided to voice his position to the board of directors. Mike Markula, vice chairman of the board, wrote a report that analyzed these two positions. Based on this report, he stated that he agreed with John, not Steve. According to Markula, Jobs at the time knew nothing about running companies and that Apple had a failed experience with the Lisa and Apple III projects, and Apple II was close to failing also, which made it necessary to attract additional financial resources for the development of the Macintosh. Back then, the board had received the authority to remove Steve Jobs from the company. Thus, Scully contributed Jobs' dismissal, although it was Jobs that hired him at one time, having asked him the question, do you want to sell Sweetwater for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? And by Sweetwater he meant Pepsi Cola. What was the reaction of Steve Jobs to the dismissal? Well, how would you react to being fired from your own company? He cried, he fought. After this loss, he sold all but one of his shares in Apple and vowed never to think about coming back to this place again. He spent a long time in depression. John Scully said that he regretted that he did not go to Jobs himself with a request to return and lead the company. And by the way, even later, in 1993, Scully was also fired from Apple. Yes, and that's the kind of thing that can happen in startups, in companies when it comes to big money. It may look nice on the picture. You created a company, you want some investments, you've got it, you found investors, they invested $5 million, $10 million, even $100 million. You've got rich at one moment. But there is another moment coming when it's time to report back to people who invested money in you. And if you don't do what they want you to do, if you don't meet their needs, pay them dividends and increase shareholder value, then guys, sooner or later, something like what happened to Jobs in the early stages of Apple's development can happen. Yes, he was a genius, but he came back to Apple only 10 years later. And the Apple we know is the Apple of the late 90s, early 2000s. In 1985, the same year he was fired, Steve started a new company and devoted his entire life to it, trying to manage it as best as he can and avoid the managerial mistakes that caused his first failure. The company was called Next, and it was a software development company. Later, Apple would buy Next for as much as $429 million. The current Mac OS we all know is based on the developments of Next of that time. Initially, it was a computer company that developed and produced graphics software and software system for higher education institutions and business. Jobs created this company with like-minded people, among whom were Bud Tribble, one of the so-called kings of politics of Apple, Susan Kare, the graphic designer who created many interface elements for Apple, Windows, IBM, OS, and others in the 80s. By the way, the logo for Next was designed by Paul Rand, who also designed logos for such companies as IBM, Westinghouse, and UPS. The logo from the famous designer cost the company $100,000 at the prices of that time. The first computers were released for sale in 1989 with the cost of $6,500. At first, they were sold to universities. Next computers had the following characteristics. For those who's versed in computers, you can compare them with the current ones. A 32-bit microprocessor with a frequency of 25 MHz, up to 64 MB of RAM, 330 MB hard drive. Seems like I'm selling it to you. A 17-inch black and white screen with a resolution of 1120 to 832 pixels. For comparison, Macintosh computers at that time had just 1 MB of RAM, a 16-color monitor with a resolution of 640 to 480, and a hard drive from 10 to 20 MB. Next was also the first computer with a chip that could play and process sounds using the Music Kit app. Perhaps the sales of these computers had not been as successful as Steve expected, but it cannot be denied that the company has had a huge impact on the computer industry in general. After that, Jobs went into another company. Yes, Next wasn't the only one, and this company you know very well, and which is called Pixar. But the Pixar story deserves a separate video, which we are already preparing for you, so don't forget to subscribe. How did Steve Jobs end up at Apple again? Back in 1994, Jobs offered his former company to purchase Next, but he was refused. Because despite the fact that the company at that time was already in a strong crisis, management didn't want to admit defeat. When the situation began to worsen and the search for a new operating system became vitally important, Apple remembered Next. Then in 1996, Jobs received an official offer to sell his company along with its products and join the leadership of the Apple company. Although Jobs' position was officially referred to as an unofficial advisor to the CEO, this did not stop Steve from gathering a team, eliminating irrelevant projects and reducing staff. He also began to pay special attention to product design. After some time, iMac J3 began to appear on the store, which even people who did not understand personal computers willingly bought. and already in 1997 Jobs headed the company again. And another 6 months after his return to the CEO position, Apple began to make tangible profits. The next 2 years, the company continued to develop successfully. Then came iPod, which drove music fans crazy. It was easy to operate, it was small and convenient, and had a nice design. In 2006, iPods already held 75% of the MP3 player market, and their sales matched sales of their PCs. Another year later, the legendary iPhone appeared, the first mobile device in the world that combined not only the functions of a phone and a player, but also a computer. I remember this moment very clearly. At that time, I was studying at the university, and the iPhone actually made a revolution. Button phones were everywhere, and all of a sudden, the square phone with a big display came up, and it could do just everything. And even later, an iPad came into existence, thanks to which Jobs proved to the world that a personal computer can and should be convenient, feature-packed, and the main thing, small enough to be taken to just about any place. Let's come back to the egoism of Steve Jobs at the time of his dismissal. Yes, he was broken, shattered to pieces, but continued working until he has not only proven his genius again, but also has significantly eliminated personal flaws that led to his downfall. Not often such successful and powerful people like Steve Jobs are able to do this. By the way, Jobs later called his dismissal from Apple one of the best events in his life, which suggests that failure is not always the end of the world. On the contrary, it is the mistakes and failures that allow us to move on and become even stronger, and Steve Jobs is a great example of this.